to any private records. We do not know why Common Core's high school math standards do not provide a pathway to STEM careers. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Why David Coleman, the lead writer for ELA, was allowed to mandate a 50-50 division between literary study and informational text at every grade level. Who was he that he had this authority and power? With no approval from English teachers across the country or from the parents of the students in our public schools, you can understand, coming from an open town meeting form of government, I felt that this was total violation and an outrage. And there was no mechanism for change. The standards had to be adopted verbatim, and there was no mechanism for ever revising them. They were to be apparently cast into concrete, and that was it, forever after. No reason ever given. There were different problems with each of the lead writers, which I have made available in various articles because everything is posted on my homepage at the University of Arkansas. But let me go on to talk a little bit about the members of the validation committee, which should have played a role that all of you can understand, particularly of those of you who are in a state legislature or in any local office, and understand that when money is spent for something, or you do something, a policy is enacted, if you want it to be evaluated, you do not ask the people who carried it out to evaluate what they carried out themselves. I mean, that just makes common sense. You ask for an independent group to do it. Well, the people in charge of the Common Core project created their own validation committee. I mean, somebody should have thought this just isn't right. The federal government could have asked for an independent group of experts to evaluate the soundness and rigor of the standards that it was incentivizing states to adopt via the Race to the Top grant competition, and you'd have to see the language of that application to understand that in it, the states, by applying for Race to the Top money, were committing themselves to these standards, and then eventually the tests based on the standards, even if they didn't get the money. So naturally, all states were submitting applications. And I will tell you, I was in one state that Bill Gates Foundation gave $250,000 to develop the application. There were about 17 states that he wanted to make sure the applications were right. And so money came not to the state Board of Education or to the Department of Education, because then we might have done something else with it. Gates Foundation chose the grants writers and had these people in 17 states develop the applications that went for the Race to the Grant competitions. One deadline was early January, another deadline was June 1st. The final release of the document didn't take place until June 2nd. Keep that in mind, that all of these applications committing themselves to these standards were coming in before the standards were either written or completed. And then they're being validated by people that the project directors have themselves chosen for whatever reason. Milgram knows why he was chosen. He was from California, and then Governor Schwarzenegger knew that he had helped to write California's math standards and simply told the NGA, I want him on the committee, period. I had been known for the work I did in Massachusetts, and I kept nagging my Commissioner of Education, whom I'd helped to put into his job on the State Board of Education at the time. And I said, I want to be on that last committee to make sure these standards are good before they come out. So I kept calling him and bugging him until finally he got his way and was able to tell me the day before the nominations closed that I was on the committee. They have lived to rue that day ever since, but the point was I got on the committee. And I'm sure the commissioner himself is not very happy. But they wanted to appease Massachusetts. Why? Precisely because of the work that I had helped to do in the state earlier. Because there was a lineup of commissioners of education behind our commissioner. He even told that to us on the State Board of Education, that if Massachusetts was going to abandon its first-rate standards and adopt Common Core, then it would be like falling dominoes. All the others would fall in place and also adopt Common Core. They had told him that. Now, what was at stake for Massachusetts? Money. We were promised $250 million of race-to-the-top money if we dumped our standards and adopted Common Core. And we did get the money. It's now, as you know, gone as of this year because it was only a 4-year grant. Now, why didn't Professor Milgram and I sign off? We were 2 of the 5 people, as was mentioned. Well, we first realized, of course, that being on the validation committee, we were intended to be rubber stamps. We weren't supposed to validate, to ensure the soundness and rigor of these standards. We were simply to do whatever they told us to do, and then to fill out a form in May of 2010 before the standards are finalized. And as Professor Milgram says, and he's preparing, because he kept copies of every document and draft he was ever sent, there were changes from the public comment draft in math that were so drastic that he didn't understand what had happened behind the scenes when he saw the final draft. Something was going on behind the scenes. We never knew about it. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that process, but a public comment draft is supposed to attract comments, and then you may change the public comment draft, but you have to have a reason for what you're doing. You have to have a rationale, and you have to present it to the public. No explanation. It was supposed to have had a STEM pathway. That was the big issue in math. It was supposed to have had what was called the third pathway to calculus, not necessarily to include calculus standards, but at least to include the standards that would lead to calculus. And lo and behold, there's no pathway there. Disappeared, just not there, no explanation. So we could not sign off because the standards were not internationally benchmarked, which means they were not comparable to the best standards out there. I had looked to see what good standards looked like in other English-speaking countries. He knew what the math standards looked like in high-achieving countries in both Europe and in Southeast Asia. They were not research-based, and I'll explain briefly. He understood that the approach to teaching Euclidean geometry, which is often taught in grade 10 in many states, but is a proof-based approach to Euclidean geometry. I had it, I mean, it's been going for about 2,000 years. It isn't like it's something new. I even used Euclid's book, because I remember the cover, Euclid's Elements of Geometry. In any event, the approach that was put into Common Core is so bizarre. It was tried out in the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and it was so bad that they got rid of it within a few years. It's never been tried on a large scale anywhere else. So the question was, why was it there? What will it do for our high school math teachers who haven't been trained that way? It's an approach to teaching Euclidean geometry that I can't explain because I'm not a mathematician, but he has explained it in his own writings. We both published on our own home pages our reasons for not signing off on these standards, just to make sure that they were available. So since 2010, you have to understand, this is now 5 years later, we have had these criticisms, and they have not been responded to, they've not been addressed, and there is no one at the level of USDE or connected to the CCSSI, the Common Core project itself. No one has ever explained why there is no pathway to STEM in those standards. 5 years later. something is definitely wrong. Instead, we are given an opposite message. These are demanding standards. These are going to make us competitive with the rest of the world. They're internationally benchmarked. Now, if you keep hearing that over and over again, if you can't read high school standards yourself, what can you do? I can't read a set of math high school standards. How many people in this room can read a set of high school math standards? I asked that question. There might be a few. And what are you by training, an engineer or physicist? Okay, yes. So this is part of the issue. Most boards of ed cannot read high school math standards. Most legislators can't read them. Most governors can't read them. Very few people accept high school math teachers, and of course they were absent from the committee. So who is going to be able to tell us that there were some serious shortcomings in these standards when the only people who knew weren't there on these committees? Nobody has ever answered that question. Let me briefly go through the flaws in the English language arts standards, but I'm only going to do the highlights because I've written about this for 5 years, and it's just about in every form of testimony I give. But most of them are content-free skills. They're not true standards. There's no real content to most of them. They stress writing more than reading, which I want to make a point of because reading research is my background, reading instruction and reading research. And anyone who's ever taught K-12 knows that good writing comes from good reading. All good writers have been good readers. You cannot become a good writer without having been a good reader. Common Core got it backwards. But again, it was developed by someone who didn't know anything about the K-12 curriculum and had never taught at any level. Common Core standards the writing standards particularly, are developmentally inappropriate at early grade levels. This we've heard from childhood educators who have signed a massive petition, 250 of them, saying that you can't ask students in kindergarten to write a paragraph explaining something. But it's inappropriate, doesn't belong there. Even in grade 1, it doesn't belong. And then when I looked at middle school children's writing, this was in New York City, where they had posted the kids' papers, and the standards asked for these 6th and 7th graders to talk about claims, relevant evidence, and make academic arguments. It was clear these kids didn't have a clue. The only kind of claim 6th graders typically know about is a baggage claim. They do not know what a rhetorical claim is. They typically haven't been given the kind of reading, and even if they were, it would be difficult for them to conceptualize what a rhetorical claim is when an author in a piece of writing is making a claim, and then to make a counterclaim or do something with it. It's simply beyond them. And it wasn't connected to any reading standards that would even help to make that sensible.